So this is the head of Bear Creek in Dundalk, Maryland, where in September of 1814, a group of Maryland militia fought bravely to keep the British from traveling up the North Point Peninsula to Baltimore and burning that city, just as they had burned Washington, D.C. a month earlier. Neighborspace is working on a trail project there that would help to tell that story, provide a much needed recreational amenity, and connect a water trail, along with several parks and schools. But because Baltimore County has not previously valued trails highly in recreational planning or budgeting, it has been a challenging 10-year struggle to advance the project, although the present administration has been helpful. As we shall see, the need to think about open space networks within our inner suburbs and the cities they surround, connecting people to nature and to important commercial and cultural hubs, is fundamental to their livability. But first, what do I mean by inner suburbs? Inner suburbs are the jurisdictions that share a border with America's largest and oldest cities. There are over 50 such jurisdictions around the country, including places like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, just to name a few, all places we will visit in this presentation. Collectively, the inner suburbs are home to 1/5 of America. Most developed along radial routes leading outside of the city. In Chicago, the radials were often rail lines, as shown here in the plan for the inner suburb of Riverside, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1868, and straddling the tracks of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which runs right through the middle of the subdivision. For Baltimore and many other cities, those radials were initially streetcar lines, connecting the city to Dundalk, Parkville, Towson, Pikesville, and Catonsville. The same was true for suburbs in Boston, connecting downtown Boston to places like Everett, Medford, and Arlington, as well as those in Los Angeles. Here is the streetcar map for 1941, making connections to places like Glendale, Beverly Hills, and Culver City. But streetcars, in spite of the fact that they operated cleanly and moved large numbers of people efficiently and affordably, were a short-lived phenomenon in the United States, ultimately dominated by the automobile. Understanding this transportation history is key to understanding the livability challenges of the present day and why green networks are so important as a remedy. Let me explain. Cars early on were handmade and expensive, the bastion of the wealthy. But assembly line techniques made them increasingly more and more affordable for the masses. The Model T sold for $850 in 1908 and actually went down in price by 20% 4 years later. Automobile registrations skyrocketed. And as they became more affordable, more and more people clamored for the freedom they offered. At the same time, the real estate industry saw the possibilities the automobile offered for developing places not served by rail lines. This led to massive road building efforts. Federal road acts in 1916 and 1921 sought to improve roads and link them to a national network. By 1925, a national system of numbered routes was adopted, and highway spending topped $1 billion. It is about then that we begin to see suburban growth rates outpace those of cities. At about the same time, we see the rise of Euclidean or traditional zoning. Today, zoning laws determine what can be built where. The right of governments to make such determinations stems from a 1920-era dispute in which Euclid, an inner suburb of Cleveland, prevented Ambler Realty from developing an industrial use in an area that the town had determined should be residential. Ambler sued, claiming that the town's actions had substantially reduced the value of its land without due process of law. In 1926, the Supreme Court weighed in, saying, no, the town was right to use its constitutional police power to protect the public from the adverse impacts of development. Under this scheme, all of the uses in this diagram must be separate from one another. You can't put apartments over top of a store, for example. Traditional zoning proliferated across the landscape following the Euclid case. It's why nearly all the first-tier suburbs in Baltimore County have a walk score that translates as car dependent. You can't easily walk from your house, a residential use, in most places, to a commercial use like a store or restaurant. At about the same time that these zoning activities were laying a foundation for what the future suburbs would look like, big business seized on an opportunity to ensure that they were only reachable by car. In 1925, General Motors acquired the Yellow Coach Company, undertaking a systematic campaign to put streetcar lines out of business all over America. Through a network of subsidiaries, GM used its financial muscle to buy up streetcar lines, scrap the tracks, and convert the routes to buses. In 1943, GM and its part suppliers combined to convert trolleys to buses in 19 cities, including those in Los Angeles. In 1949, a federal grand jury indicted GM for criminal conspiracy in the case, but the eventual fine of $5,000 was too small to be much of a deterrent. By 1950, General Motors had converted more than 100 electric streetcar lines to gasoline-powered buses. The ultimate goal, of course, was to replace public transportation with cars to allow automobiles to proliferate. It is a story I hate to tell because GM put a lot of food on my family's table over time. My grandfather, Harry Prentice, was twice the plant manager at the GM plant in Baltimore and held that same job in Cincinnati, Ohio, Oakland, California, and Los Angeles. He is in the middle of this photograph from the Baltimore Sun, standing just right of the white car with a handkerchief in his pocket. The 6 millionth to come off the line at the former GM plant on Vernon Highway in Baltimore in 1973. Even during the Great Depression, we kept a focus on building roads to support the automobile. Between 1933 and 1940, federal relief agencies poured $4 billion into roads and streets, putting people to work and getting visible results. Among the notable road builders of the time was Robert Moses, chief of a series of New York government agencies. His plans for opening up Long Island, once the bastion of farmers, fishermen, and industrial millionaires, to middle-class city dwellers by constructing a vast system of highways, are cited as a prototype for highway expansion in suburbs across the country. We shall see shortly that the plan also facilitated the construction of one of the largest mass-produced housing developments the country has ever seen. While road building continued apace during the Great Depression, home building did not. In the years following the stock market crash of 1929, home construction fell by 95%. Bankruptcies escalated, leaving many people looking for housing and leading to the rise of encampments of the homeless, known as Hoovervilles, around the country. When Roosevelt replaced Hoover as president, he created the FHA, which began to guarantee home loans, making it much easier than it ever had been before for the average person to buy a house. This radically transformed home ownership in America, at least for whites. FHA policies redlined many urban areas and discriminated against people of color, making it nearly impossible for them to build wealth through home ownership, a challenge that was particularly bad in Baltimore. The FHA program favored new houses, which were being built where there was vacant land in the inner suburbs. Gas was cheap, and a basic car cost a few $100s, making commuting to work economically affordable. After World War II, the VA also jumped into the Low Interest Loan Act, making it possible for returning servicemen, at least those who were white, to purchase a home with no down payment. These factors fueled demand for housing, a need answered by William Levitt, an entrepreneur who took what he learned about mass production of Navy barracks during World War II and applied it to the home building industry. And you can see this is a photograph of Levittown, which was built on Long Island beginning in 1947. Levitt's houses were simple, uniform, and inexpensive, costing between $8,000 and $9,500. The places so created, however, were far from idyllic. Everything was spread out and hard to get to without a car. There were no cultural institutions. There was little escape from other people into nature, except for a few totemic trees and the banal foundation landscaping. Songwriter Malvina Reynolds called the new form ticky-tacky. Author John Keats called them boxes and fresh air slums around the edges of American cities. Historian Lewis Mumford called these new suburbs an asylum for the preservation of illusion. And journalist Howard Kunstler notes that the main problem with it was that it dispensed with all the traditional connections and continuities of community life and replaced them with little more than cars and television. It is a form that dominates the landscape in the inner suburbs that surround Baltimore City and many other cities across the US today. And the prevalence of that form in Baltimore County also helps to explain why home values are not competitive with those in most other metro jurisdictions. This chart looks at home values between 2012 and 2021. Baltimore County is the dark black line. The top line is Howard County, and the bottom line is Baltimore City. And you can see that this has changed very little over time. Another challenge with this pattern of development is, unfortunately, that few rules were in place, save traditional zoning, to guide where these new subdivisions were built. Little thought was given to the protection of natural resources, the creation of parks, and the management of stormwater runoff in their vicinity. It is among the reasons why today there is a shortage of open space, as shown here in Baltimore County, where 65% of residences, those within the regions of the map that are orange and yellow, lack access to adequate open space within a quarter-mile walk. And it's also why the vast majority of tributaries flowing from the county to the city and on into the Chesapeake Bay are impaired by nutrients and or sediment from stormwater runoff. By the mid-1950s, there were numerous communities along the arterial roads leading out of the cities, but they were disconnected and clogged by an ever-increasing volume of cars. In 1956, at the behest of then-President Dwight Eisenhower, Congress passed the Interstate Highway Act, paving the way for the development of 41,000 miles of new expressways. It proposed to link up most cities with more than 50,000 inhabitants and included beltways around the largest. The chief political justification was that the new expressways would ease the evacuation of cities in the event of a nuclear attack. With construction beginning in 1957, Baltimore's is the nation's first Eisenhower or defense beltway in the nation. So let's stop and take stock of where this history has left us. The advent of the automobile and the greed it unleashed have led to a lack of open space in neighborhoods, aging and mass-produced housing infrastructure that isn't competitive with modern construction, a degraded environment, and communities that are largely unwalkable and car-centric, factors that are anathema to quality of life. For they are among the factors that have made many inner suburbs unlivable to one degree or another in the United States. This chart shows the livability rankings for roughly 1/3 of the inner suburban jurisdictions across the country, based on the American Association of Retired Persons Livability Index. It is hard to get a high score, even for a brand new suburb on this scale. The best suburbs achieve a score of between 60 and 70, above the red line on this chart. And a difference of only a few points is a big deal. At 50, Baltimore County's first suburbs are at the bottom of the pile, besting only those that surround Louisville, Atlanta, and Detroit. How are the rankings determined? There are 7 categories, and within each, AARP looks for both outcomes on key metrics and the presence of specific state and local policies. Among the metrics are neighborhood, looking at things like proximity to destinations, transportation, looking at how many trips are on foot, environment, looking at air and water quality, and health, looking at the prevalence of obesity and access to exercise opportunities. So if an area doesn't fare well on these outcomes, what can it do? And is open space at least part of the solution? And the answer is that there's a lot of evidence out there that publicly accessible networked open space, not just new parks, done in just the right amounts and just the right places, will indeed contribute to improved livability. Let's look at some of it. David Barth, a well-known planner and landscape architect, argues in a new book that we have to look at streets, bike lanes, sidewalks, greenways, trails, transit, blueways, and utility corridors as a means of connecting people to green hubs, cultural resources, and institutions. Given the level of challenges that exist and increasing scarcity of open space, a whole system approach is needed to better use existing infrastructure to achieve livability, otherwise known as sustainability. This approach has come to be known as green network planning, beefing up the connections that exist with trees and sidewalks, and adding new trails to connect people to existing and new parks, cultural resources, and institutions. So in this diagram, we've beefed up the tree canopy on the street to connect people to this pocket park, to this larger park, and ultimately to this green belt, which presumably surrounds the town. All of this is done with the goal of ensuring that everyone has access to quality open space within a 10-minute walk, as proposed by the grassroots park organization 10minutewalk.org. Why a 10-minute walk? Well, 50% of the population is too old, too young, too poor, or too disabled to get in their car and drive to open space. Is the approach applicable to inner suburbs? I've been criticizing for suggesting that it should be. Well, David Barth, whose book we just mentioned, says it is. Moreover, 26 inner suburban jurisdictions from around the country have signed on to this movement, including 3 in Maryland, College Park, Gaithersburg, and Rockville. Going back to our livability ranking for the inner suburbs, we can see that suburban jurisdictions in Washington, D.C., particularly those in Arlington County, and then on the Maryland side in Montgomery County, as well as Minneapolis, are among those that AARP has determined to be great places, livable places. So that begs the question, do they have robust green networks? And the answer is yes. This map from Rails to Trails shows existing trails in Washington, D.C. and its southern inner suburb of Arlington. Look at the green belt that goes around the city of Arlington and the connection with D.C., where presumably many of Arlington's inhabitants work. Here's a look at one of Arlington's trails, the 19-mile Mount Vernon Trail. Some of you may have had the pleasure of using this trail. It's lovely. This map looks at the extensive connectivity of DC's northern suburbs in Montgomery County with the district. Look at how you can get from Chevy Chase to the district, from Silver Spring to the district, and from College Park to the district. Here's a look at one of those corridors, the Little Falls Trail in Montgomery County. This map looks at the extensive connectivity of the city of Minneapolis with its inner suburbs. Look at the connections from downtown to the inner suburbs of St. Louis Park, Golden Valley, and Robbinsdale. Here's a look at one of those corridors, the North Cedar Lake Regional Trail. Compare the results from the inner suburbs of Arlington, Montgomery County, and Minneapolis with this map of Metro Baltimore. While the city has done some work to create trails, you can see that there are absolutely no connections to the inner ring suburbs in Baltimore County. This indeed does help to explain the county's lower ranking relative to other inner suburbs. And while the city has a robust plan for improving its green infrastructure network, and I would say that the city's plan is probably the best one in Metro Baltimore, Baltimore County has none and is the only urbanized jurisdiction in Metro Baltimore without one. The city's green network plan includes the Baltimore Greenway, a project of rails to trails and others that will link 75 neighborhoods and be within a 15-minute walk of half of Baltimore's population. It has goals of promoting social equity, improving health and wellness, protecting the environment, creating alternative transportation options, and promoting economic development. And this trail is going to happen with a large coalition of public and private partners and already $3.5 million in direct investment. What's more, Ernst & Young has tabulated a number of benefits to spending $28 million on the Greenway's completion, including $314 million in property value increases, which equates to roughly $7 million in new property tax revenues for the city, $2.9 million in avoided health costs owing to more walking and biking, environmental impacts equivalent to 430 to 580 fewer cars per year. The fact that other jurisdictions, like Fulton County, Georgia, that share a low livability ranking with Baltimore County on our list, are improving should be an impetus for the county to act. This slide shows a report analyzing existing regional trails in Metro Atlanta and their gaps. In recent years, Atlanta has done much to add trail connectivity between its inner suburbs and its downtown, including Path 400, connecting Atlanta to inner suburbs in Fulton County. The Atlanta Beltline, which forms a greenway around downtown Atlanta, and has many connecting trails to that city's inner suburbs, cost $559 million to build to date, and has resulted in $4.6 billion in private development, an 8-fold return. Urban trail networks can have significant economic impact as well as health and environmental benefits. Which is in no small part why Path 400, which will connect the inner suburbs of Sandy Springs and Buckhead, which are out here, to downtown Atlanta, down here, and many other trail networks are in the works. The inner suburbs and the cities they surround are dependent on one another for their ongoing livability. Almost 1.3 million people live in urban Greater Baltimore. Looking at the city's population, those of the inner suburbs in Baltimore County inside the county's urban-rural demarcation line, shown here. Their livability challenges do not respect political boundaries. And their livability scores, again, looking at the AARP Livability Index, are not robust. Again, you see Baltimore County tied with Queen Anne's County in Metro Baltimore for last place. We must insist that our local governments do more individually and collectively with respect to the creation of robust green infrastructure networks if we are to compete locally and nationally for the tax base that will sustain the metro area going forward. A few recommendations. First, plan. Ensure that the comprehensive plans of local governments embrace green network planning and the 10-minute walk. Next, develop green network plans that connect communities to nature, cultural amenities, and commercial and institutional hubs. And finally, ensure that local park master plans support green networks. Partner. We need a range of public and private partners, including nonprofits like land trusts, to be involved in the planning and development of green networks. We need to encourage cooperation between city and county governments, those that are separate sovereigns in particular, like Baltimore City and Baltimore County. We are somewhat unique around the country. In many places like Los Angeles, the city and the county governments are one. Hence, they cooperate. Finally, fund. Use adequate public facilities ordinances and impact fees to ensure that all new development, retail and commercial, contributes to the cost of building green networks. In Baltimore County, we have an adequate public facilities ordinance that is unfortunately not enforced. We need to ensure that local capital improvement plans support green network plans. And finally, we need to leverage other federal, state, and private resources. You can find a copy of this presentation if you're interested on the NeighborSpace website. Join our email list from the bottom of that same page and email me as shown.